Hello, grade 5. If you could turn in your novels to page 87, and the title of our chapter is Silver Like a Star. And again, remember, this is Amon speaking. After we set off again, Sergeant Brody saw that I was limping, and Mother told him through the interpreter about my bad foot. So I got a lift, a piggyback ride, on Sergeant Brody's back all the way to the base. No one had done that for me since Father died. It felt so good. And the sergeant was right. At the base, they did make a real fuss of me, of all of us, particularly Shadow. Nothing was too much trouble. We slept in a warm bed, ate all we wanted, had a shower whenever we liked, and they had a doctor there too who had a look at my blister. She said it was infected and that I'd have to stay on the base for a while and not walk on it until it had all healed up. They even let Mother phone Uncle Murr in England. So Mother and Shadow and me, we stayed there on the base. It must have been for nearly a week, I think. They gave us a little room of our own, and Mother slept a lot. And when my foot was better, I played football with soldiers. Remember again, grade 5 football here is soccer. And that was when I first learned to play Monopoly. It was Sergeant Brody who taught me. I learned to say my first words in English, and he learned some Dari too. Sergeant Brody and me and Shadow, we spent a lot of time together when he wasn't busy, when he wasn't out on patrol. Like all the other soldiers, he kept wanting to take photos of Shadow and me to send home on his phone. Once, he showed me a live video of his daughter and his wife taken on their phone. They were waving at me all the way from England and shouting thank you to me for saving Polly. I should have been happy, but I wasn't. There was something that was troubling me, and it was troubling Shadow too. I could tell. I knew by now that we'd have to be leaving soon as my heel was better, and somehow she seemed to know it too. As the days went by, Shadow wanted more and more to stay with us. But I could see she loved being with the soldiers too, particularly with Sergeant Brody. He had even kept her favorite ball to remember her, the one that she'd always liked to play with. The soldiers would throw it for her, and she'd chase it right across the compound. Remember, grade 5, a separate area that has buildings in it. Bringing it back, but not letting it go till she was given something to eat in return. But she never played with them for too long. Always she came back to sit near me, and I'd catch her looking at me, and we'd both know what it was we were thinking. Is she Polly? Is she Shadow? Would she be coming with us when we left? I knew the answer. She knew the answer. I think we both kept hoping that both of us were wrong. I could feel that she was becoming theirs again, an army dog. Sergeant Brody's dog. Polly, not Shadow. She still slept with us in our room and often came to lie down beside me with her head on my foot. I still hoped that she would be coming with us, but I knew already deep down that it wasn't going to happen. That she would be staying on the base with the soldiers, that she was back with Sergeant Brody where she belonged. And she knew it too, and was as sad about it as I was, and as Mother was too. She often told me later that she could never have imagined that she could become so fond of a dog. I think all the soldiers could see my sadness. The soldiers may have been exhausted when they came back into the base after a patrol with their rifles and their helmets, but they always had a smile for me. They all knew by now why we were on the road and what we were running away from. all about how Mother had been treated by the police, about how Grandmother had died. Sergeant Brodie came in to see us on the evening before we left with the interpreter, who told us that the soldiers had collected some money to help us on our way. A whip round, he called it. I think I knew what was coming next from the sad expression on his face. He said it all through the interpreter. He could hardly look at me. About Polly? I'm sorry, Amon, but she has to stay here. She's an army dog. Maybe you can come and see her again when you get to England, I mean. How'd that be? He was only trying to soften the blow, I realized that. But who knew if we would ever even make it to England without Shadow to lead us there? I cried when he'd gone out. I couldn't help myself. Mother said it was for the best, that we'd be fine on our own from now on, God willing. And this time, she said, we were going to look after our money. That was why, with Shadow beside me on the bed, I spent most of our last night on the base hollowing out the heels of our shoes, the best place we could think to hide our money. Shadow watched me all the time. She knew for sure that these would be our last few hours together. I could hardly bear to look at her. When we left the next morning, the soldiers were there to see us off, and so was Shadow. Sergeant Brodie called for 3 cheers, and when it was over, he stepped forward to say goodbye to us. He pressed something into my hand. The interpreter was there to help him as usual. Our regimental badge, Amon, he was telling me. The sergeant says you've earned it. He says he hopes you get to England all right, and when you do, and if you ever need any help, let him know. He'll be there. So that special gift, that regimental badge, is the badge that that particular regiment wears. And he was given actually a badge as well. So let's continue on reading. And if you want to see Polly again, just ask. You can always get in touch with him through the regiment. And he says to thank you for bringing Polly back to him, for saving the lives of his men, and that he'll never forget what you did for us, for all the lads, for the regiment. I crouched down to say my last goodbyes to Shadow, stroked the dome of her head, and ruffled her ears. But I couldn't say anything. If I spoke, I knew I would cry, and I didn't want to do that, not in front of the soldiers. As they drove off the base, I longed for Shadow to jump up and come with us, but I knew she wouldn't, that she couldn't. This was the last I saw of her. They drove us to the nearest town and put us on a bus. I sat there clutching my badge. I looked down at it for the first time. It was silver, like a star, with what looked like a picture of castle walls on it. And there was some writing below that I couldn't read then. It said, Royal Anglian. I still got it. I take it with me everywhere. We were on our way again to England, to Uncle Murr in Manchester. Sitting there on the bus, I remember I tried hard to think of Ryan Giggs to stop me feeling so sad about leaving Shadow. But it didn't work. Then I looked down at my star, and I squeezed it tight. It made me feel better. That silver star always has, ever since. So grade 5, a really sad part of the story where Amon has to say goodbye to Shadow. And it's interesting, it says that up to this point in time, he has not seen Shadow again, but he has that regimental badge, and that regimental badge kind of is a connection that he feels with Shadow, because he knows Shadow still is working for that regiment. Okay, we're going to continue on. and turn the page. We'll read the whole story. I need the whole story. Now our narration shifts. Instead of Amon speaking, we've got Grandpa speaking here. All this time, as Amon was telling his story, he hardly looked up at me at all. It seemed to me, as he was telling it, that he needed to relive his memories without any kind of distractions. He spoke so softly that he could almost have been talking to himself. His voice often barely a whisper. Sometimes I had to lean right forward to hear what he was saying. But throughout it all, his voice had been steady until the very last bit, the moment he had to leave Shadow behind. I could hear then that he was fighting back tears. When he got up suddenly and rushed out of the visiting room, I was sure it must have been because he did not want me to see him crying. I knew, too, that he might not come back, that he might be too proud to have to face me again after that. But I waited there anyway, because somehow I felt there was at least a chance that he would come back. After all, he'd come back the last time, hadn't he? Sitting alone at the table, I wished more than anything that Matt could be with me. Remember again, Matt's the grandson, the friend of Amon. Amon wouldn't have run off like that if Matt had been there. They were friends, best friends. Matt would have been able to talk him around somehow. It was then, with Amon's story fresh in my head, that I first began to consider seriously whether there really might be something that could be done to help Amon and his mother, besides just visiting them, I mean. The longer I sat there and thought about the poverty of their lives in Bamiyan, of the suffering the whole family had lived through, of their determination to get out of Afghanistan and to come to England, the more I hated to think of them locked up like criminals in this place. There was a terrible injustice going on here. Amon's story had awoken the journalist in me. I wanted to know more. I wanted to know everything. When Amon did come back a few minutes later, his mother was with him again. I hadn't expected this at all. There was so much I had to find out about. I'd been hoping that when he came back, he would be able just to pick up his story where he'd left off. But I knew Amon was much more shy and reserved with his mother around, so I wasn't all that hopeful that he would talk as easily or as freely as he had before. I could see his mother had been crying and was still very overwrought. She was rocking back and forth and clutching a handkerchief in both of her hands. His mother spoke up then, but only to Amon, and in her own language. When she had finished, he translated for her. Mother says she had to come and tell you herself that we cannot go back to Afghanistan, that the police would torture her again. She says the Taliban are not defeated. They are everywhere, in the police, everywhere. They will kill her just like they killed father. She says that we have been living in England for 6 years now. This is our home. She says our lawyer cannot help us anymore, that the government won't even let us appeal. She even prayed to God that you will be able to help us. Her dream tells her you will, but she has come to ask you herself, to beg you to make her dream come true. I didn't know what to say, only that I had to say something, and something encouraging too, but without making promises that I could not keep. Tell her I can do my best, and I will, I told him. But she must understand, and so must you, Aman, that I'm not a lawyer. I'm not sure what I can do, what anyone can do. But I do know that for me to be able to do anything at all, I will need you to tell me your whole story, from the time you left Shadow behind and got on that bus that day until now. I mean, how did you manage to get all the way to England? How have you been living? And what exactly happened when they brought you in here? The more I know, the better. I need to know everything. Aman talked to his mother for a few moments to explain things. She was calmer now, more composed. And then he turned back to me, took a deep breath, and began his story again, reluctantly though, as if he did not want to remind himself at all of the rest of the story, as if he was dreading having to live through it again. So, grade 5, interesting. Mother has a dream of Grandpa coming, wants to know if he will help because she kind of knows that he might be the last chance for them to be able to not go back to Afghanistan, but to stay in England. And then in grade 5, we have Aman, who is saying this part of the story is really, really hard. But Grandpa needs to know the whole story in order to help him completely. So I hope you enjoyed the reading, and there's a question sheet available for you. Remember, you only have to work on those numbers of questions that are listed in the lesson. Okay, we will talk to you later. Bye now.